go ahead and hit record and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program 2, Cfap 2 webinar. My name is Karen Stetler and I work at the Land Stewardship Project and will be emceeing our time today. This webinar is sponsored by Farmers Legal Action Group, Minnesota Farmers Market Association, Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, Sustainable Farming Association, University of Minnesota Extension, Minnesota Farmers Union, Minnesota NCR SARE, and Land Stewardship Project. Partial funding for this webinar comes from Extension Risk Management Education. This collaborative effort is aimed at reaching beginning specialty crop and livestock farmers who are often underserved by programs such as Cfap 2. These are extremely challenging times for farmers, and all of us today want to make sure that you are as informed as possible about what opportunities exist so that you can make the best decisions for your situation and farm. A big thank you to Jane Jewett, who is our technical producer for today, and a note that she will be recording this webinar. And in addition to this English version, there will be translation into Spanish and hopefully Hmong. So just another note, the participants will be muted, but please feel free to use the Q&A or chat boxes with comments and questions. So a quick overview of our time together. We'll have about 45 minutes to learn about the details of the Cfap 2 program, how to connect with FSA offices, and how to apply. This will be followed by farmer Dan Zimmerly, who will share his experiences about applying for Cfap 2. And then we will leave time at the end for some questions, some of which were submitted as you registered, and Teresa Kivney with SFA will be facilitating the question and answer time. We also have FSA staff people on the call. Angela Hanegraaff, Lisa Campbell, Daniel Mahoney, and Kelvin Galletley are also on the call if there are some specific questions related to FSA. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce the Cfap 2 presenters, starting with Megan Roberts, who is a farmer and a University of Minnesota Associate Extension Professor with the Agricultural Business Management Program. In 2020, her focus has been delivering information and training on federal COVID-19 relief programs for the agricultural sector. Joining her is Stephen Carpenter, Deputy Director and Senior Staff Attorney at Farmers Legal Action Group, FLAG, in St. Paul. His work has centered on discrimination in agricultural lending, debtor-creditor issues, disaster assistance, federal farm programs, sustainable agriculture, and direct marketing, and livestock contracting. And Lindsay Keene has worked as a small-scale livestock farmer and for Heifer International's farm in Arkansas. She holds a master's degree in public service in addition to a law degree and is an attorney on staff with Farmers Legal Action Group. Lindsay, Megan, and Stephen, I'll turn it over to you.
So hello there, this is Stephen Carpenter from FLAG. Dan is also going to present. I don't know. Well, you have I guess we will talk about the substance of the programs, and then Dan will come after that to talk about a farmer perspective. So Lindsay Keene and I are from FLAG. We wanted to point out to you, first of all, that we are writing a guide to Cfap 2, a very long and dry handbook that can help people who are trying to use this program. We're thinking we're going to get it out early next week, and it will be on our website. It will be accessible to everyone, and so we hope that you'll feel free to use that resource. The thing that I wanted to start us off on was just a very brief overview of Cfap in general. So Cfap 2 is what we're talking about today. The reason there are two Cfaps is that there were actually two programs. There was a coronavirus food assistance program that went on earlier in the year. Now people are calling that Cfap 1. And this one is now open. It's Cfap 2. And it kind of makes sense to when we start off to say what's the same and what's different about these two things. The first thing that I wanted to point out is that this is a USDA program, U.S. Department of Agriculture, And just to be blunt about it, there is a lot of money out there in Cfap 2. The USDA says it's about $13 billion. And this is money that comes to farmers in a check. You don't have to repay it. I mean, that's the good news. It's not a loan, it's real money. People are getting paid. Program is not just a boondoggle or something that very few people can participate in. The second thing I wanted to emphasize is that Cfap 2 is actually quite different from Cfap 1. So you may have had an experience with Cfap 1, you may have applied or know people that applied. This is a different program. They're both aimed at helping people who are farming and struggling because of the coronavirus. But the eligibility rules are different, the way they pay, the crops are different. I mean, it's similar, but it's definitely quite different. So if you felt discouraged about Cfap 1 or it didn't work quite as well as you had hoped, I think it's still worth taking a peek at Cfap 2 and trying to understand if that can benefit you. There's a couple of other things I just wanted to add too about the sort of interaction of the two. So let's suppose you did apply for Cfap 1 and you were able to get a payment. You are not automatically signed up for Cfap 2. You have to go in and or send it in and do that on your own, again, totally separately. And so if you did Cfap 1 and got paid, you have to do Cfap 2 separately. If you did Cfap 1 and didn't get paid, like something you weren't eligible, something went wrong with the application, you can still apply for Cfap 2. There's no reason not to. And if you didn't do anything at all with Cfap 1, you can also apply for Cfap 2. No restrictions in that way at all. So the sign-up deadline is December 11th. And that is the super brief overview. I am now going to turn it over to Megan, and we're going to talk about some eligibility for farmers, for crops, and how this thing actually works. So, Megan.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, just to reiterate, Cfap 2 is not Cfap 1. They're wholly separate and distinct programs. And one other note, Cfap 1 is over. So we're now talking all about Cfap 2. Sometimes there's that confusion about whether we have moved on to the Cfap 2 program. So I'm just really briefly going to go over some of the eligibility related to being a producer. And if there's further questions at this, since we do have FSA available at the end in Q&A, they might be able to provide some additional information. In general, if you are currently still in the business of farming and you have risk and an ownership share in one of the eligible commodities that Lindsay is going to talk about next, you are quite likely eligible as a producer for Cfap 2. Now, there are some very specific list of eligibility parameters related to your gross income. For example, if you're over $900,000 of annual gross income, you need to have at least 75% of your income coming from farming. Some of those nitty-gritty things you can see very clearly on farmers.gov under producer eligibility. The one thing that I want to mention further without getting into all of those details is the information about contract growers versus a grower with a contract. So those are two different things. And a contract grower, someone that does not have the risk and ownership of their agricultural commodity, would be ineligible. But you can be a farmer that grows something with a contract associated with it and still be eligible. And I'm going to use myself as an example here. We raise hogs on our farm and we own those hogs throughout the duration of their lives. We have no one else that is ownership share of those animals. However, in order to sell our hogs, we do have a contract with a company in order to, on a weekly basis, send our hogs to market. That is not something that would make us ineligible. We are a farmer that happens to have a contract. we're not a contract grower. If you have questions about this, we can talk about it more, but I think more importantly, we want to talk about some of the eligibility of commodities. And what you're going to see is that with Cfap 2, there is a lot more commodity eligibility. So I'll hand it off to Lindsay.
Thanks, Megan. Hello, everyone. As Karen mentioned earlier, my name is Lindsay Keane. I work with the Farmers Legal Action Group here in St. Paul. And I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about, yes, the wide range of commodities that are eligible under Cfap 2, as well as I think what is an important issue for many people considering whether to apply, and that is how payments are actually calculated and what you might be eligible to receive. So to begin with, as you can see on the screen for those of you who are on your computers, you can see there are a lot of commodities that are eligible. And I think the best way to talk about this is actually to frame it in the way that USDA does. And as you can see, they categorize the commodities into three broader groups. There's what are called sales crops, there's price trigger crops and livestock, and then flat rate crops. Now, when you hear those words, they may not mean a lot. And I will say it can be sort of confusing and you might wonder why it matters. And right off the bat, I'm just going to say these categories, they are a bit confusing, but they exist for a reason. And that reason comes into play in terms of how the payment calculation is made and how the crops became eligible for Cfap in the first place. So just understand there is a reason for them. And I know for some of you looking at the screen, for example, there are some livestock such as bison or goats or alpaca that are categorized as sales crops. And there are other livestock like beef cattle, hogs, sheep that are considered price trigger livestock. So the important thing is to know that all of these are eligible, but the payment that you will receive might be different for them. So I'm going to kind of quickly walk through these categories and what they mean, and then we'll get into the payments. So to begin with, as you can see, and actually, Megan, let's go back to that one slide real quick. When we look at sales crops, I think a good way to think about this category, or at least the way that I do, is sort of as a catch-all category. For example, this includes specialty crops, and I think there's over 200 specialty crops. So you've got fruit, vegetables, nuts, honey, maple sap. So you have hundreds of crops that fall within that category. Then aquaculture, nursery and floriculture. There are a variety of other livestock, quail, ostrich, turkeys, alpacas, bison, buffalo. So lots of livestock fall into this category. And then there's a few things that USDA just sort of says are miscellaneous. So goat milk, which was not eligible under Cfap 1, tobacco, wool, mink. So this category really does include many, many commodities. And in a minute, you'll see why they're all sort of clumped together under the title of sales crops. But moving on, we've got this category called price trigger crops and livestock. And this category, it's probably the most similar to the Cfap 1 eligible commodities. And it's called price trigger for a reason. And that is because USDA determined that every crop or livestock in this category had a 5% or greater price decline between the middle of January and the end of July. And so in essence, that price decline triggered its eligibility for the program. And as you can see, under this category, you've got a lot of the standard row crops, corn, soybeans, we've got barley, sorghum, sunflowers, wheat, things like that. And then you have a limited group of livestock, so beef cattle, hogs and pigs, sheep and lambs. Many of those were also eligible for Cfap 1. But an important distinction is that under this category, no breeding stock are eligible at all. So I would keep that in mind for those of you who are raising livestock. And then also a price trigger livestock product would be what USDA calls dairy, but really what they mean is cow's milk. So that is eligible, as well as various varieties of eggs. So you can have eggs in the shell, frozen, liquid, or dried eggs. And then broilers. And again, as Megan mentioned a minute ago, so long as you are not a contract grower of those broilers. And one thing I just want to mention on this category, although each of these is eligible for Cfap 2 because USDA determined that there was this 5% price decline, you as a farmer don't have to show that individually. So if a commodity is eligible, if it's listed, you are good to go. So you don't need to be able to say, yes, I can prove I had a 6% price decline. So just wanted to make that clear. And then finally, the last category are what are called flat rate crops. And these are called flat rate crops simply because, as you'll see, there is one flat rate that's paid out for all of them. And all of these crops are acreage-based crops. And essentially, when these are eligible crops, even though there wasn't enough data to show a 5% decline, but USDA still determined that they're going to be eligible for the program. So we've got things like hemp and rice, wild rice, sugar beets, alfalfa, buckwheat. So there's a variety of flat rate crops. And the last thing before we get into payments that I just want to point out, again, this list that you're looking at is not exhaustive. There are hundreds of commodities. So I think a useful tool, if you go on the farmers.gov website, there's something called the Cfap to Eligible Commodities Finder. And this is a really handy tool, I think, if you're just trying to figure out, is this program right for you? If you go to that commodity finder, you can mark in every crop or livestock or commodity that you raise, and it will populate a screen that tells you whether for each one it's eligible, and if so, what kind of payment category it would be under and different eligibility requirements for that. So anyways, I would just say check that out if you're curious or if you don't see your specific crop or commodity on this list. So, and the last thing I want to say on eligibility. So the first thing, you need to have an eligible commodity, but then there's a few other requirements that you need to meet. That commodity has to be grown in the United States. It has to be intended to be marketed for commercial production, and it has to be the raw commodity. And we're going to talk about that a bit more. But essentially, Cfap 2 would not pay you for things like cheese or maple syrup or wine or olive oil, though you might be able to receive a payment for the raw version of that kind of value added commodity. And there is one kind of glitch with this. I know I just said a requirement is that the commodities be commercially produced. There is a rule in the program that states that an ineligible commodity is anything from a garden that's either home or commercial. And I point that out because both, it's a little confusing, the wording. First of all, it makes sense that a home garden might be ineligible because eligible commodities have to be sold, they have to be for commercial production. But it is confusing what USDA means when it says a commercial garden is ineligible. And I want to point this out because for some of you, you might be wondering, well, do I have, a commercial garden or a small farm? And the reality is there are no definitions of what a garden is. We do know, and the folks from FSA may get into this a bit later, we know that some people of FSA had sort of verbally said, if you are selling an eligible commodity, don't worry about that rule. I think the lawyer in me is a bit nervous about that because the reality is the rules that are written say commercial gardens and home gardens are ineligible. So I think what I really want to emphasize with that is simply that we want to encourage you to apply regardless because we don't know whether or how that rule might be enforced. But if you are denied, and if FSA says you are denied because it determines you're a commercial garden, please reach out to FLAG, to Stephen or I, and we would be happy to work with you to figure out some next steps. So I did just want to point out that kind of eligibility quirk. Okay, so finally, moving on to payments, which I think are probably what most folks are most interested in. So I'm going to quickly go through these three categories of commodities and talk about what the payment structure looks like and how you might get paid. So this first one, as you can see, are for the sales commodities. And again, those specialty crops, aquaculture, nursery, and miscellaneous, livestock, and others. So the way the payments work for this category, these are all based on the farmer's 2019 sales. And so that means anything sold in the calendar year 2019. So if you had an eligible commodity that you harvested at the end of 2018, but sold in 2019, that would absolutely count. Conversely, if you more recently harvested a crop in 2019, but waited to sell it until this year, that would not be included. So we're really looking at the calendar year for 2019. And those sales are then going to be multiplied by a payment factor that USDA has created. And this is where it gets a little tricky for this category of crops. And for those of you looking at the screen, you can see there are 5 sales ranges that USDA has come up with. And those ranges each correspond to a different payment factor. And so how this works, for example, there's a range for if you sold up to $49,999, you would be paid at 10.6% of those sales. Then if you sold between 50,000 and just under 100,000, you would be paid at 9.9%. But what's different, and I'm going to give an example just to make this clear, is, for example, if you just sold, let's say last year you sold $30,000 in eligible sales crops. Your CFAP payment would be a pretty simple calculation, 30,000 multiplied by the 10.6%. However, let's say you sold $66,000. The way this calculation is going to work is that initial $49,999 would be paid at a rate of 10.6%. And then the remaining $16,000 and I guess $1 would be paid at the rate of 9.9%. So hopefully that kind of makes sense in how they go about determining that. And the only other thing that I think is really important to mention for this category, I guess there's 2 things. One is that if you're a new farmer, so let's say you weren't farming in 2019, but you just began farming in 2020, you can still be eligible for Cfap 2. But what's going to happen is they will look at your actual sales for this year. So instead of looking at your sales from 2019, you're again going to be looking at your actual 2020 sales. And it's important to note that for all of these, you as the farmer who's applying, and Megan is going to go into this in a bit more detail, you are self-certifying. So when you apply, you're putting the total number of sales, amount of sales, but you are not, when you apply, providing the receipts for all of those. But you do need to have that documentation and those receipts. And FSA could ask you more questions. They could ask you to substantiate, the amount of sales. But it's just important to know that when you're actually applying, you don't need to be submitting that information at the time you apply. So keep that in mind. And the last thing on the sales commodities, and this goes back to that requirement that only raw commodities are eligible. And I think this is important because for many of you, you might do processing or packaging, or maybe you're making cheese out of the milk. And what that means is you can still be eligible under the sales crop category, but what you are going to have to do is figure out what portion of your product is raw versus what portion of that sale came from it also having added value, be it through packaging or processing. And sometimes there is a clear way to determine that. For certain crops such as maple sap to maple syrup, FSA has a conversion factor that you can use to figure that out. For other things, you might have to just do your best to try to calculate what that would be. And I realize I wish I could give more specific guidance. I know that's not that helpful, but I think however you determine what portion of your sales are from the raw commodity, you just need to be certain that you have a reason for doing it and documentation to back it up, because FSA will want to make sure that your numbers are both reasonable and accurate. So that's a little kind of gray area in how to determine that, but it is important to know that you can still be eligible. You just need to parse out the value added from the raw commodity. Okay, so that's our sales commodity. Moving on, we're going to talk about those price trigger crops and livestock. And again, these are the ones that had the 5% price decline. So to begin with, let's start out with livestock and livestock products. And I'm just going to quickly run through, there's sort of a different method used depending on what type of product we're talking about. So first of all, if you are a farmer and you have cow's milk, this is how it's going to work. You're essentially going to be paid just over a penny per pound of your actual and estimated production that occurred between April 1st of this year and December 31st. And as we're all well aware, we haven't hit December 31st. So what's happening in reality with this is that FSA or USDA is going to look at the actual amount of milk that you produced from, I believe it's April 1st through August 31st. And then they're going to prorate to figure out your daily average. And they're going to use that daily average to determine your estimated production up through December 31st. So that's how the calculation will work for milk. It's also important to note that if you're a seasonal dairy or a dairy that has dissolved, you can still be eligible so long as you're in operation at the time you apply for the program. And also all that will happen is that your payment will be prorated for the actual number of days that you are producing milk. So just keep that in mind. Okay, then we have for eggs. The way that eggs work, you are paid essentially at 75% of your 2019 production, multiplied by a payment rate that USDA has come up with. And that rate is different depending on whether you have shell eggs, liquid, dried, or frozen. And so to give you an example, shell eggs, the payment rate is 5 cents per dozen. For liquid eggs, it's 4 cents. Frozen eggs, it's 14 cents per pound. So that gives you a sense of that. And again, if you're a new farmer and you just began selling eggs in 2020, you can use your 2020 production instead of your 2019 production. So then moving on to broilers. So this is an easier calculation. It's simply $1.01 per bird, essentially, from your 2019 production. So those are broilers that left the farm for slaughter in calendar year 2019. If you began farming in 2020, you are able to use the actual production thus far into the year. And okay, finally, we have our price triggered livestock. So again, these are our beef cattle, hogs and pigs, sheep and lambs. So what's important about this category is that the farmer gets to choose the highest inventory for each type of livestock. You can choose the date at which you had your highest inventory anytime between April 16th and August 31st. And then that will be multiplied by a payment rate that has been set by USDA. For cattle, it's $55 per head. For hogs and pigs, it's $23 per head. And for sheep and lambs, it's $27 per head. And it doesn't matter whether it is a hog versus a pig, a sheep versus a lamb. There's one rate for all. So that gives you kind of a brief sense of how the payments work for price trigger livestock. So now we're going to talk briefly about the price trigger crops. And this calculation, and Megan, I might have you jump ahead. Thank you. So this calculation looks a bit more complicated, but essentially for these crops, and again, these are a lot of the standard row crops, what's going to happen is USDA is going to look at the number of eligible acres that you have. They're going to multiply that by a few different things. First, by your 2020 approved yield, then by a payment rate that's set by USDA, and then by something that's called a crop marketing percentage. And this isn't defined anywhere in the rules, but it seems, and maybe FSA can clarify if I say anything wrong, but it seems that the crop marketing percentage is essentially trying to figure out, what percentage of the crop would be marketed in the rest of this year. So that's what that is. So you would multiply all of those things together. And the important thing about this category is that even if you do all of that and you end up with less than $15 an acre, USDA is going to jump that up. So no matter what, you will get a minimum of $15 per acre for price trigger crops. The other really important thing to know if you are a farmer who raises any of these crops, they define what are eligible acres. And eligible acres are your share of 2020 FSA determined acres or reported acres as are reported on your FSA 578. And for folks who haven't worked with FSA before, Form 578 is also known as an acreage report. And this is important. This is one of the few categories of crops where if you haven't worked with FSA in the past, you will have to interact with them to get this report filled out, because it is the only way that you can be paid for a price trigger crop. And FSA has said they are happy to work with folks who haven't worked with them before to get the information necessary to fill out the 578, but do know that you will need to do that in order to apply. So that could take a little longer for folks who haven't worked with FSA in the past. So, okay, moving on to our last category. Those are the flat rate commodities. This is probably the easiest to figure out the payment for, and it is simply $15 per eligible acre. No matter what your yield was, that does not matter. They look at your eligible acres, and again, it has the same definition as for price trigger crops. So that means, again, that if you do not have an acreage report or a form FSA 578 on file, you will need to work with FSA to get that filed. And then you would get paid at $15 an acre for any of those crops. So I feel like I just threw a lot of numbers and formulas at you all, but hopefully that helps to give kind of a broad picture of how you might be paid. And if there are questions on any of this, please put them in the Q&A, and those of us presenting and the folks from FSA will hopefully be able to answer. So I think with that, I am going to pass it on.
Thanks, Lindsay. A lot of the things that Lindsay just shared really overlap with some of the things we're going to talk in this next section. One of the reasons why we have worked together as a partnership of organizations to create this webinar is because we assume a lot of the folks joining us have not worked with FSA previously, that this is Cfap 1 and 2 are new experiences working with FSA. So what does it mean to set up a farm with FSA? I am generalizing a little bit, but you can see here there is some basic identification information that you will need to share with FSA. Name, address, personal information. That's going to include your tax identification number. If you are operating your farm with a specific business structure, such as an LLC or as a formalized S corporation or C corporation, you're going to have additional forms to fill out to document that operating structure. As I mentioned, because there is some eligibility requirements for the individual related to adjusted gross income or AGI, there is a form to fill out for that. And then there is some additional information related to getting the money deposited, direct deposit information to enable payment, and then finally some conservation compliance and proof of no controlled substance violations. So that, again, kind of what Lindsay just said, that's a lot of information thrown at you, but FSA has worked with farms throughout history to set them out as farms. So it is a process that has a specific set of steps, and it is not insurmountable. Then, after you're set up as a farm, or if you've already worked with FSA, you don't need to worry about that last slide, you're already there, you need to work through the Cfap 2 form. For Cfap 2, there are now kind of 4 different ways that you can apply. If you are a sole proprietor that has already worked with FSA, you have even gone a step further and you've created a farmers.gov e-authentication account, you can go ahead and actually apply completely online. There is a process to do your whole application as a sole proprietor. If you've got those pre-steps done, you can do it online. You can also go online, manually download your applications and fill out the information and work with your local FSA office to get that dropped off. That does work better for something like a sales commodity because you do not need to have some of those acreage and yield information pre-populated. So that isn't going to work to manually download if you need some of that pre-populated information. You can use the payment calculator, which is sort of a quasi apply a little bit online, but still work with your local FSA office to get everything finalized. And we're going to show an example here of what that payment calculator looks like. And then finally, if you are really looking more for some hands-on help, you can utilize the FSA website to simply find where your local office is. and set up a virtual phone appointment to have a USDA service center complete your app for you with the information that you provide them. Another thing that we wanted to talk about as we move through this presentation, knowing that some of you either work with farmers that have not worked with FSA previously, or you yourself have not worked with FSA, is that there's some skepticism of applying. Is there a potential benefit of applying? Well, if you do have sales from last year, 2019, you qualify under these sales commodities or any of those other categories, there is the benefit of real dollars. As Stephen mentioned, this is not a loan. Cfap 1 and 2 are not loans. Some of the other governmental programs that have come out for small businesses through COVID are loans. So there is that confusion. Cfap 2 is a direct government payment. You do have to recognize it as income on next year's taxes, but there is no expectation that you would repay it as long as you're submitting documentable, accurate, eligible information. There's also been some skepticism as to, have my losses as a farmer been as great as other businesses or other farmers? And we saw that in some of the questions that were submitted before this webinar. Folks saying, well, my CSA actually did pretty good. My farmers market crops, they were worse. You know, should I apply or should I not? Am I eligible to apply? As Lindsay mentioned, the federal government has already done the calculations and shown that there have been marketing or price losses for the eligible commodities that are in Cfap 2. So you are required to provide your documentation for your farm, but you're not required to provide the documentation of how much COVID has or has not impacted agriculture as a whole across the U.S. That is something that the USDA, the Office of Management and Budget, has already done. So that is a very long way of saying, if you are eligible, there is probably a very good reason why you should apply for Cfap 2. But no one can make that choice other than you. If you're still skeptical, that's a question that you're going to ask yourself. I just added this morning, and this is just a quick screenshot from the USDAfarmers.gov website showing that 19,000 plus farms in Minnesota have already applied for Cfap 2. So if you're wondering, am I the only one that's going to be applying for this? That is certainly not the case. And you can see how much has already been paid out in Minnesota. I would argue that our sales commodities, which is probably where a lot of folks on this webinar are falling, make up a very small portion of this. And maybe if you apply and you tell your friends that are having CSAs, farmers markets, growing some of these specialty crops and livestock to apply, maybe that number can increase a little bit. Wanted to also show you an example, and really Lindsay went into this really well, so I don't have a lot more to share here. But let's say you are a specialty crop producer and you are raising direct to consumer apples, maybe some grapes that you sell directly to another winery. You have some honey production. You're not doing any further processing. You have raw agricultural product. And your Schedule F from last year under sales for this raw agricultural product shows $95,400 worth of revenue. The payment calculator that is provided by USDA shows how this is calculated. So the first $49,999 is going to fall in the 10.6 payment factor, and that equals $5,300. In range 2, that would be the remainder of your sales from 2019, the 45,401 penny, and that gets multiplied by 9.9. Adding those together, we see that the estimated Cfap 2 gross payment is $9,794. So on this example, I just included sales commodities. But if you also, in addition to raising something that falls into the sales commodity category, maybe you have some flat rate commodities, those can be added together. So you do not need to have all of your production falling into one of the categories. In fact, that's probably one of the areas that, as someone that works with farmers, I see folks missing this. Maybe their creamery, if they're a dairy producer, put together a document that shows what their milk sales were, and you go to FSA, you sign up for that, but you forget about the fact that you're also selling alfalfa and corn. And so you want to make sure that you don't get too much tunnel vision going on and only think about one category. What is happening across your farm, and do you qualify for multiple different categories? Just a quick example there, and we do have some additional questions that we can get to at the end. I want to quickly say you might need to balance the time it takes to sign up for Cfap versus your potential payment. This is likely more of an issue in Cfap 1 than Cfap 2. Now, with specialty crop producers being more eligible with this program, it's likely worth your time. And one final additional note about Cfap 2 not being a loan: it is not something that you have to repay as long as your commodities are documentable and eligible, but you do need to put it on your Schedule F. It goes in as agricultural program payments for next year's taxes.
So thank you, Megan. We want to talk for a few minutes here about what happens next. That is to say, you filled out your application. What happens after then? And for people that are used to dealing with USDA that maybe grow corn and soybeans, it's something that comes kind of easy, and folks are familiar with how a USDA works. For the next few minutes, we're going to talk about rules that apply to everybody who applies, but with in mind people, say, to do livestock or specialty crops that are just starting out and don't have quite as much experience dealing with USDA. So the first thing to emphasize is that when you actually look at this application, it's pretty short, and you don't have to provide a lot of documentation on the application. You're doing what USDA is called self-certification. You're saying, I had 30 cows and 28 calves during this period, and a bull, and this is how we're going to calculate it. You just say that. You don't have to provide any evidence in the application itself. However, as Megan pointed out and Lindsay alluded to, USDA rules say that you need to have some sort of documentation of your production or your inventory or your sales. You don't have to produce that documentation when you apply, but you need to have it. And we'll talk about what that might mean in a second. But this is what will happen to your application. You will go to USDA, your local county committee is going to look at the application, and they're going to say, does this look reasonable? Do we want to look at more documents? Do we want to hear more from this person? And if they have any doubts, they have the right and the ability to ask you to provide this documentation that we just described. And so for your production, for your inventory, did you actually have 30 cows? They can ask you, and you need to have some sort of a way to show them that what you said on your application was accurate. And they don't use this term, but the way that I kind of think about this is that you need a paper trail. You need some sort of evidence on four corners of a piece of paper that shows that you pretty much did what you said that you did. So USDA can ask you, Can we look at your documentation? They're going to try to see if that documentation, if they do ask you, matches up with your application. And they want to know that this whole thing is reasonable. So what sort of documentation do you need to use? USDA is a little fuzzy on this. I mean, they give you some examples of the sorts of things that you can use, and some of them completely make sense. I mean, if you're talking about sales, you might have sales receipts. You would have filed your taxes last year. You're going to have some records. For anything that you sell. If you're talking about, let's say, your inventory of livestock, or the 30 cows we were talking about, you're going to have more documentation than you actually maybe realize. You're going to have a veterinarian bill. You're going to have hauling when you sell and you didn't haul it yourself. You're going to have probably purchased some feed or vaccinations, or you're going to have a paper trail of costs and of evidence that you spent money that supports the idea that you had a cow-calf operation with about 30 cows. That's the sort of thing that you need. And it's worth adding too that it's okay to keep your own records. I mean, sure, it's great to have some sort of scale weights, from an independent source. But if you keep your own notebook and you say, oh, we had another calf in February, so that's, this was the mother, and you just keep little notes, that's perfectly fine. They need to look reasonable. And what's important is you need to keep them at the time the events happen. It's what's called contemporaneous records. And so in the legal world, and also with this program, it looks more persuasive if it's something you wrote down at the time it happened, as compared to try to draw it out of your memory later and write it all down. So when we publish our guide, we're going to have every single possible example of something that we know that USDA thinks is a reasonable documentation, and you can help yourself by looking there. The basic rule, though, is if you're going to deal with the USDA, you're going to need records, and I can't say enough, you want to keep those records. Because what will happen next is USDA, after they look at your application, will either approve your application, you'll get the money you sought. They may, what USDA calls, adjust it. They may say, well, this person's really not eligible for 25,000, it's only 22.5, and they may change it and they may drop it down. Or they may deny you completely. They may decide that you're not eligible, or they may have looked at your documentation and it's not persuasive to them. It's possible that they say to people, no, you're not going to get anything. If that happens, either they adjust or deny, you will eventually receive a letter from them. It will say why they changed your award or denied it, and they will give you what are known as appeal rights. And so we want to talk just for a second about the appeal rights. But first, let's add in another tiny wrinkle, spot checks. So you apply, they look at your application, they maybe ask you for some documentation, maybe not. Eventually, down the road, USDA is going to do what they are calling spot checks. They describe this as sort of randomly picking out people just to check in and see if they followed the rules or not. Even more reason, you need documentation, and keep that documentation. Don't toss it even after you got paid. So let's suppose something goes haywire. You don't get the money that you thought that you were eligible for, or you don't get anything at all. USDA has a completely coherent, I will say, complaint process for appeals. You get to try to get that decision overturned. If you end up in a situation where you feel like you need to appeal, feel free to contact FLAG. We may be able to offer you a bit of help. The appeals process for USDA is real. It's not a fake appeals process. People really do win. It's not not everybody, but it's worth doing if you end up having a problem with USDA. I also wanted to briefly say that we often assume that all farmers in Minnesota, and elsewhere for that matter, are almost completely white men. We know that's not true now, and it really never has been true. But we also know that there has been a longstanding problem at USDA and in a lot of other parts of the agricultural world of discrimination. That is, people being treated differently based on their sex, their race, the language they speak, their religion. And that is not just wrong, it's illegal. And if you feel like you've been discriminated against, a set of rules were applied to you that weren't applied to everybody else, you have the right to file a discrimination complaint. If you feel strongly that this happened to you, again, I would encourage you to contact FLAG. Lindsay and I can help you understand a little bit better how that process works. We also write about the discrimination complaint process in our Farmer's Guide to Cfap 2, which will soon be finished, as well as write about the appeal system. I had one last point that gets raised occasionally, especially as we talk about who might be eligible, who's not used to dealing with USDA, and that is the question of citizenship. So when you look at the details of the eligibility rules for CFAP programs, you can be a citizen, you can be a resident alien, and actually, that is to have a green card, and actually you can be what USDA calls a foreign person. You can be not a citizen, not have a green card, and still be eligible for this program. You're going to be asked if you are a citizen and asked for a tax ID, but the rules do not prohibit you from applying based on your status as a foreign person, to use their terms. It's obviously a decision each producer is going to need to make for themselves, but the short answer to the question, do you have to be a citizen, is no. There's no requirement that be the case. I may have missed something, but that's fine. We want to do two more things before we wrap it up. We have an excellent farmer point of view, and we also want to take your questions. And I know I speak for Lindsay and me, and perhaps others too. If we don't get to your question here, or you come up with questions later, contact us. We're easy to find, and we'd be happy to talk to you more. So, Dan, the farmer viewpoint.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name's Dan, and I run Cedar Crate Farm. We're a small produce farm near Mankato, Minnesota. So small is about 2 acres under cultivation. We sell through a CSA program, the Mankato Farmers Market, and we sell a little bit of wholesale to St. Peter Food Co-op and a couple of restaurants. So, but 90% of our sales is through Farmers Market and CSA, so direct to consumer. We applied for and received, although I haven't got the check yet, for CFAP 2. And my experience was actually my FSA person that I had been working with on another project and farm FSA program reached out to me and let me know that she thought I'd be eligible and that I should apply. And so I looked into it. I downloaded the calculator. It's like an Excel spreadsheet with some macros. Plugged in my numbers and figured out that, well, yep, this is going to be worth my time to fill this out and go through the steps. So I filled out the application. I sent it back to my farm service agency person. And without too much extra work, she said that my application was approved and that the funds were dispersed. So like I said, I haven't received the check yet. I just found out that we were approved yesterday. So I expect the check should be in the mail in the next couple of days, maybe a week or two. I don't know how long these things take exactly. So my experience was like super duper easy. The reason I think that is because I was already in FSA's sort of system as a farm and as a farmer for working on another program with them, the farm storage facility loan, which we use to fund a pack shed for our farm. And so that made a lot of things way easier. The other thing I think is through that process, I developed a relationship with a person at the FSA agency. And so she already knew kind of what my operation was like, what kind of crops I grew and those kinds of things. So I think that was super helpful that I just already established that relationship. A lot of times, and my experience reflects this, is that the folks at FSA are very, very used to working with people who raise corn and soybeans and maybe hogs and like beef cattle. That doesn't mean that they're not willing to work with people who do something different. Although your mileage may vary. I've heard stories of some people having trouble. The thing is like they have to help you. They can't say that they won't help. I mean, they have to. That's their job. And so, for example, when we were working on our farm storage facility loan application, they were thinking that we needed to have crop insurance to be eligible for this program. I was able to use my Google Foo and find an example of a farm service agency blog post from a different state. Mind you, this is a federal organization, so it doesn't matter what state you're in, that funded a similar project for a pack shed for a vegetable farm and exempted them from requiring crop insurance because it didn't provide meaningful coverage or risk management, I guess, if you will, for that project. So once they found that out, everything kind of worked from there. Sometimes they'll refer to like the state agency or maybe even higher up the chain. But if you can find sort of evidence from a farm service agency, other people that have worked with FSA and successfully done something, usually things can work out. So hopefully the people that you deal with are willing to work with you. In my case, I guess maybe I got lucky, or maybe, I don't know. But anyways, it worked out for me. It wasn't that hard to apply. It only took me like 20 or 30 minutes to kind of fill out the application. And because we were already in FSA's system, it made it simple. If you are a first time, if this is the first time you're talking to FSA, it may take you longer to apply for this. We already had the Acreage Report filled out for our other projects, so it was pretty straightforward for us. So checks in the mail, I think, and it worked well for us. I'm happy to take any questions or talk with anybody one-on-one if you want to explore deeper into what my experience was like. So I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Again, it was pretty quick and painless for me. So maybe I'm lucky, but hopefully it's quick and painless for everybody.
It was also quick and painless for our farm, although coincidentally, of all the places in Minnesota, Dan and I have the same FSA office. So we're both using the same office because we're in the same county. Teresa, I think we are handing it back to you for questions and answers. And as Teresa is reading those off, I want to point folks to the contact information. If you have something that goes beyond what you can get at your local FSA office, Stephen, Lindsay, and I are all willing to take further questions one-on-one.
Well, I think the first one that I'm going to read has been answered. Can startups apply as well? What are the requirements? And I guess a startup beginning in 2020 could apply. Is that correct? They'd use their 2020 stats. Okay. And I want to say, I know farmers who just started this year. And while this was going on, I just emailed them and said, hey, you might be eligible. Next question. It's not clear from reading Cfap 2 guidelines how CSA farms fit in with the guidelines, although it states that CSA farms may qualify. Can you clarify that?
I wonder why. Well, I think CSAs are definitely eligible. The question would be which category they would go into, and then how the benefit would be calculated. If that person's still around, it would be helpful to know what sort of problem they think they might be having.
And maybe it's confusion over that commercial garden thing.
Well, if they're big enough to be a CSA and sell, let's hope that they're not called a garden. And if they are, contact Lindsay or me. We would be very interested to know if that's happening to people, and we would really work hard to help them to get it reversed.
Yeah,
very good.
I'll just say that we're a CSA farm. Our CSA sales, which we had calculated out, did qualify. That was not an issue for us at all. you may want to, hopefully you have records of what went into your CSAs for a year, so you can attribute a dollar value to them. So like per individual crop, we've been doing that every season. So we have really good records. We know exactly what was in every single box every week since we started our CSA 6 years ago, I think. So yeah, it definitely qualifies. So
I'd like to add a little bit to that. So all farmers, including urban farmers and farmers who run CSAs, are eligible for Cfap 2 if they meet the eligibility requirements. And that's all of these commodities in all of our programs, and there are different eligibility requirements. So it is important to get that clarified. And so as far as my understanding for our NAP-based programs, so we have subscription CSAs that are farmer driven. I think that's what most of these would fall under. So the farmer owns or leases the land, organizes CSA producers, produces the farm products, and recruits customers and our subscribers. The other type of definition which we look at are shareholder CSAs, is a consumer-driven operation. The consumer organizes a CSA, owns or leases the land, and hires the farmer to produce the farm products. So in that instance, your local office may request to show a copy of the CSA contract or agreement to make sure that it is the eligibility requirements are met. So it is has been stated a few times. County offices may, the COC, the staff themselves will not ask for different eligibility documents, sales receipts or whatnot. When some of these do go to review by the local county committees, they may indeed ask for some of that eligibility requirements. So just they're always more than happy to answer questions. And if you have questions on what's being asked, and just ask for that clarification. So.
Thank you. Should farmers contact the FSA office they reside in the county they reside in, or where their farm is located?
Oh, I think I actually might have just typed an answer to that one. So what USDA says is you should contact your local, what they're called the service centers. And I think in many cases that's going to be in your county. There are some instances where it might not be, but there is a way if you want to find out, if you've not worked with FSA before, you're just not sure, you can actually go to farmers.gov/CFAP. And if you scroll down to the very bottom of that page, and again, I think I just put that link in the Q&A box, there's a section that says find your local service center. So you can put your state and your county and it will give you the contact information of the office you should contact. I also imagine, and I would think FSA would reiterate that, if you contacted any office, they would probably help you figure out, what's the correct office if it's not theirs. So
if I live in Brown County, but my farm is actually in Blue Earth, which county do I go to then?
You can actually make your application in any USDA service center nationwide. Your control county will be typically based on your home address, unless you can make a statement on what's most convenient for you. So you will have a control county. That's where your eligibility documentation will be maintained. But as far as the applications go for the CFAP program or any other program, you can make those applications at any service center nationwide. It is easier typically for your control county because they're going to have all the documentation on file.
Excellent. I think this was answered. How does citizenship and immigration status affect eligibility?
Yes, to say again, citizens are eligible. If you have a green card, you're definitely eligible, but also you can be what USDA uses kind of this funny term, a foreign person, and those folks can be eligible too. So I see nothing anywhere that says if you are undocumented, you're not eligible.
Thank you, Stephen. This question, we sold some vegetables wholesale this year, but only a small fraction of what we sold in 2019 because our main institutional buyers bought so much less due to COVID. Are we eligible for 10.6% of our 2019 sales, or is it less because we did sell a little bit?
I think this gets to the sort of skepticism of applying and were my losses big enough? It is not up to you to ensure that your 2020 losses were great enough. And you certainly don't have to have had complete losses for 2020. So even if you sold in 2020, you're still eligible for applying for your 2019. And in this case, I think they're referring to the sales commodities category. And then the percentage is going to be based on how much your overall sales were from 2019 in most cases.
Just to kind of clarify that a little bit further, the kind of the important thing to take note here, if you're not a first-time producer of an eligible sales commodity, then you'll actually use your actual 2019 sales. So then the percent payment factor of 10.6 would be applied to that 2019 sales. If you're a new producer, you did not produce anything in 2019, you'd be eligible for your 2020 sales.
Okay, and that was just another question in the Q&A box. FSA agency told me I couldn't apply because I have to use my sales for 19 and not 2020. Is this true?
So if you did have 2019 sales, indicating that you're a producer in 2019, you would use your 2019 sales because those are what the government's determining were impacted by the COVID. So the only case where you would use your 2020 sales for the sales-based commodities if you're a new producer in 2020.
And so for this question, it sounds like this person might wish they could use their 2020, not their 2019. And the way that I read the rules is as you just said, that you're going to have to use your 2019 if you produce in 2019, but it's not true that you're just not eligible. It's and maybe that's just sort of a
yeah, because this question was whether they could even apply.
Yeah, they can.
Yes,
of
they
course
can
apply. Yes, can apply, and if you get turned away at the door, Lindsay and I would like to know about it.
Yeah, we can follow up with this person too. Great. Are those 2019 sales wage numbers broken down? Yeah, I think this was already answered. Broken down by crop or overall farm gross? And I think you answered that. Are cows and heifers considered breeding stock and therefore not eligible?
Yeah, so for breeding stock, the way it's defined for the program, yes, bulls and cows, boars and sows, rams and ewes, for example, are all considered breeding stock. And so there is a blanket prohibition against getting a payment for those.
Very
Heifers
good.
destined for the breeding herd would be ineligible, but if you have female animals that you sell, those could be counted. Certainly gilts and heifers get sold for the beef market and the pork market. So those would be some examples where they might be eligible depending on what you are using them for. But cows, they're pretty much out the window.
This is great. Jane, do you have any other questions that you've seen? Otherwise, I think we've fielded them all. Oh, this was a recurring question. Is this a grant or a loan? And it is a grant, different from the weirdness of the first Cfap.
No, Cfap 1 is also not a loan. The governmental COVID relief that is a loan would be our economic injury disaster loan from SBA, as well as the Paycheck Protection Program is considered a loan until you get it forgiven. So Cfap
right.
1 and 2, definitely not loans.
Yeah, I was confusing it, I think, with EIDL or PPP. Yeah.
There are so many acronyms, so definitely not the first person to make that slip of the tongue.
Well, I think that's
thank you. Teresa, I think that does go through all the questions. I think the The others have all been answered really, really well by our panelists. Thank you.
Great work.
Fantastic job.
Yay.
Excuse me, could I just make one comment? And I just want to make sure that, you know, everybody on the call is aware of this. But USDA Farm Service Agency does offer translation and interpretation services for anybody who needs that. And you can work with your local office or through us at the state office to secure those services at no charge. So that's just something that was brought up during the call that I wanted to make that comment on.
Did any other of the panelists want to make any last comments? Otherwise, I want to thank all of you on the panel. I want to thank all of you who participated. Watch for the recorded version of this webinar and keep getting the word out so that other folks consider Cfap 2. If it's right for them, look for that funding. I want to also thank the organizers and the funders for making this webinar possible, and everybody have a great rest of your day.
Yep. I'm going to just chime in a quick second, and I appreciate it. The invite for myself, Angela, and Lisa to be in on this call, as well as Dan Mahoney. If general questions, and approach your local service centers and that farmers.gov/CFAP. It's a wonderful tool. It's a wonderful website to be utilized. But if you do have any problems or concerns, and feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Kelvin Gelletley. So I'm the Chief Program Specialist out of the Minnesota State Office. Lisa Campbell or Angela Hannengraf, and we'll also be more than happy to help anyone else.
Great, thank you, everybody.
All right, thanks everybody. I am going to end the webinar now, and the recording will be available in a day or two.